Hello friends, Buddy here at Haas of Props, and today's build is going to feature these 12-inch Han, Luke, and Tauntaun figures. They belong to a friend of mine who only recently found the Luke one, and he asked me if I could incorporate the two into a display. As we know, Han and Luke don't appear on Tauntauns in the same scene together, but my friend wanted to display them together and incorporate a little something extra into the piece. Let me show you what I mean, and let's get started. I started with a 22-inch diameter circle cut from some 3/4 inch plywood. This will serve as the base for the display to be built on, and to build up the majority of the display, I'll be using some XPS foam, which is insulation foam you can get at most home repair stores. I cut a 22-inch diameter circle out of the foam, and I'm going to glue it to the plywood with some wood glue. I'm using wood glue so it'll soak into the wood and the pores of the foam, but you could also use Gorilla Glue or Tacky Glue. I made sure the foam was firmly pressed down. The glue will take hours to dry, so I needed to be careful not to bump it or the foam could shift. And to build up some variation in the terrain, I'm using extra pieces of XPS foam cut to organic shapes. This foam is actually really easy to cut, and you don't need anything fancy, just a utility knife and it'll slide right through. Once I figure out the placement, I like to mark their location with a pen, so as I'm gluing the pieces onto the base circle with some tacky glue, I don't need to remember their exact placement because it's already defined. Han and Luke will sit in the middle of the circle, but in order to give them a more dynamic silhouette, I'm going to have Han sit a little higher on the center mound. And so the outer areas won't be so flat, I'm also adding a few smaller mounds as well. Now, to remove the harsh edges, I'm using a hot wire foam cutter. This is a great tool to slice and shape XPS foam, but it does create some toxic fumes, so make sure you wear your PPE and work in a well-ventilated room. I'm using the cutter to bevel off the edges and create a more organic looking edge. While I continue, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will help my channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you can get notified when new projects release. Thank you! Next, I figured out the exact placement for the Tauntaun's feet, because I'm going to carve out the spots for them and their tails to sink into the foam a little. This way it'll support the figures and it will look like they're standing in the snow. To carve it, I'm using a medium grit sanding disc on my Dremel and simply carving about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch deep into the foam. This does create some mess, so make sure to keep a vacuum handy or work in an area where it's okay to be a little messy. So in this case, your dining room table might not be the best choice. Here's what it looked like with the areas all carved out. One thing about these grooves as well is they will allow the figures to sit on the display without needing to attach them, so this way they won't get damaged with glue or adhesive. The other element my friend wanted added was an Imperial probe droid after it self-destructed. So I printed a free file, primed it, sanded it, and I'm going to spray it with some glossy black paint. Once the print dried, this is how it was looking. But it needed to look as if it had exploded, so I cut up the pieces on a bandsaw and figured out their exact placement. Then I attached these to the foam with some CA glue. Now, CA glue will eat into the foam a little, so I was very spare with the amount I used. And you definitely don't want to use any quick setter like Zip Kicker, because that will really create a problem. But since texture is going to be added, a little imperfection in the foam from the glue will be okay. Now for the first layer of texture, I'm using a tube of this cheap latex caulk. It's available in a variety of stores and it's pretty affordable and works great for a project like this where we're using it for its looks more than its actual purpose. I squeezed out a large amount and used a palette knife to smear it onto the foam surface, but I avoid the foot and tail areas that I carved out because I don't want to fill these back in. While the caulk is still wet, I filter some sand through a sifter onto the caulk. This will just add some variation to the surface and not let it look like something has just been spread over the top of the foam. Then I lightly tapped the sand to make sure it is pressed into the caulk. So this way the caulk will hold onto it and it won't be brushed off when we paint it. Another product that you could use is some sealing texture. This is a little pricier than sand, but it does create a really nice texture that can be used for a variety of projects. To use, I simply mixed it with some white acrylic paint until all the powder was completely incorporated into the paint. Then it can be applied the same way as the caulk. The only thing about the ceiling texture is it does take longer to dry because the texture absorbs the moisture from the paint and it slowly dries out. The good thing about that is working time lasts longer. Once all that is dry, I coated all the texture with some layers of white acrylic paint. This just added some paint to secure the texture in place and it helped even out the surface so it didn't look as grainy. Once the white was dry, I thinned some royal blue and airbrushed this in areas where I wanted to create some shadows. I know this is a very brilliant blue, but by the time I'm done, it will create some subtle shading underneath the snow. Then I repeated the process with a very thin spray of a mixture of burnt umber and burnt sienna. This I wanted to be even more subtle, so I didn't apply as much and wasn't as heavy-handed as it was with the blue. Then I thinned the white with some water and applied a layer over the entire piece again. This thin layer will tone down the blue and the brown so it creates shading and also will give the snow more depth like actual snow has. At this point, when the paint had dried, I created some droid legs from some scrap pieces of PLA I had laying around the shop, and these I glued around the display and even added one into the joint where a leg naturally would have been, just to help the explosion be more recognizable. Next, using some black, I touched up the droid pieces which had gotten a lot of white paint on them at this point, and painted the newly added legs as well. Then I airbrushed some black around the pieces to add some scorching, or like, you know how smoke or exhaust stains snow, that's the effect I'm going for. This I just wanted to be very subtle and not too pronounced or concentrated. And then repeated the same process with some burnt umber, but again I'm doing this very subtle and light so that I don't build up an area too dark too fast. Now I'm going to use some of this gloss medium on the eye domes on the droid just to make them look like the film. This gloss medium can be applied like this to add gloss to an already painted surface, or it can also be added to a flat paint in order to turn it glossy. And the last step was to paint the plywood base black. I needed to apply 2 coats because the wood was very dry and sucked in some of the paint, leaving it a little uneven, but a second coat evened it out and all was great. And with that, the figures can be added to the base and the display was complete. The Tauntauns look pretty happy with it, don't you think? They must not be aware of the fate that the film has in store for them. By switching up the substances used to create the texture, it adds natural variation and doesn't look as if it's all just one thing, and the layers of airbrushing add variation to the coloring, so no matter what angle you look at it, the display has color variation and doesn't appear to be solid white. I hope you enjoyed this build. I know I did. If you did, please give this vid a thumbs up. If you have any questions about techniques or materials I use, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer. Please subscribe if you haven't already, share with all your friends and family, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at Haas of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.